After losing my roles, I expected relief. What I didn't expect was how exposed life would feel without them. There's a strange vulnerability that comes after identity collapses. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that asks for sympathy, but the quiet realization that nothing automatically explains you anymore. No title speaks on your behalf. In O routine justifies your time. In O expectation tells you where to stand. You are present, and that presence is unanswered. Returning to ordinary life felt disorienting. The streets were the same. The people moved with the same confidence. Everyone seemed to know where they were going, and I realized how much of that certainty was performance. Not fake, rehearsed. I moved through conversations carefully, not because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, because I no longer wanted to say things that weren't true. "How are you?" became a complicated question. "I'm fine" felt dishonest. "I'm lost" felt excessive. So I learned to say, "I'm here." Most people didn't know how to respond. Without roles, my days felt unfinished. Not empty, unresolved. I woke without urgency. I slept without exhaustion. Time no longer demanded productivity, and that freedom felt suspicious, as if I was neglecting a responsibility I couldn't name. I noticed how often the world rewards certainty. Decisiveness is admired. Clarity is trusted. Doubt is tolerated only when it resolves quickly. I had no resolution to offer, and that made me difficult to place. I stopped being invited into certain conversations. Not intentionally. Naturally, people gravitate toward those who reinforce the rules they live by. I no longer did. Loneliness appeared, not sharp but wide. The kind that doesn't ache. The kind that simply exists. I learned that loneliness isn't always about lacking people. Sometimes it's about lacking shared illusions. I spent more time alone than I ever had before. Not hiding, observing. I watched how easily people filled their lives with motion to avoid contact with themselves. How often noise replaced meaning. How quickly distraction solved discomfort. I had lost the ability to distract myself, and that loss felt irreversible. One evening, sitting alone, I asked myself, what am I allowed to want now? The question startled me, because without roles, desire felt undefined. I wasn't chasing success. I wasn't proving anything. I wasn't becoming someone recognizable. So what was left? The answer didn't arrive as words. It arrived as sensation. I wanted depth, not excitement, not achievement. Depth. I wanted days that felt inhabited, moments that didn't require narration to feel real. I realized then how often I had lived toward future validation, toward a moment when things would make sense, when effort would convert into worth. Without that horizon, life felt frighteningly immediate. There was no later to hide in. I tried returning to old patterns. Not fully, just enough to test them. They didn't fit. Conversations felt scripted. Goals felt external. Ambitions felt inherited. I understood then that once a structure collapses, rebuilding it unchanged is impossible. People asked what had changed. I struggled to explain. I stopped disappearing into usefulness, I said once. They laughed. I didn't. There was grief in this phase. Not for what I lost, but for how long I had delayed myself. For the years spent optimizing instead of inhabiting. For the silence I had mistaken for peace. That grief came in waves. Quiet, persistent, honest. I began to see the cost of living consciously. It is slower, heavier, less efficient, but it belongs to you. I didn't feel better. I felt clearer. And clarity, I learned, is not comforting. It removes excuses. One morning, walking through the city, I noticed something subtle. I was no longer scanning for approval. Not from strangers. Not from systems. Not from myself. That absence felt like standing without armor. And I realized how heavy that armor had been. Still, something was missing. Not identity. Direction. Without roles, every choice felt final. There was no script to blame. No path to default to. Each decision carried responsibility. And responsibility without identity is terrifying. I began writing again, not to define myself, to document experience, to anchor moments before they dissolved. The act felt grounding, not expressive, stabilizing. I understood then that life after roles isn't about replacement. It's about orientation, learning how to stand without leaning on labels, learning how to choose without permission, learning how to live without applause. Some nights I wanted to quit, to return to being understandable, to become legible again. But each time I imagined that future, I felt a familiar tightening, the kind that comes from self-betrayal. So I stayed, in the uncertainty, in the slowness, in the discomfort of becoming visible to myself. This phase didn't feel like progress. It felt like exposure. And yet, something inside me knew. This was not a detour. This was the cost of honesty. I didn't know where this path led. But for the first time, the question wasn't, who should I be? It was, how do I want to exist? And that felt like the beginning of a different kind of life. After exposure comes choice. Not the dramatic kind. The small, relentless kind that repeats every day. Without roles to default to, every interaction fell heavier. I could no longer hide behind function or expectation. When I showed up, it was unmistakably me. Unfiltered, unlabeled. And that made connection risky. I noticed how often people connect through roles. Colleagues bond through work. Parents through responsibility. Partners through expectation. Without those anchors, conversation floated. Sometimes it deepened. Sometimes it dissolved. Both outcomes felt personal. I began saying no more often, not because I wanted distance, because I wanted consent. If I agreed to something, it was because I chose it, not because it fit a role I was trying to maintain. This confused people. It confused me too. One afternoon, I met someone new. There was no introduction that placed me. No context. No reason for interest. We talked slowly, without efficiency, without agenda, and I felt something unfamiliar. Safety without familiarity. That frightened me, because safety without structure offers no guarantees. You can't hide. You can't perform. You can only participate. As the connection grew, fear followed closely behind. Not fear of rejection, fear of being known without armor. I realized how often I had mistaken distance for autonomy, how often independence had protected me from intimacy. I found myself wanting to retreat, to simplify, to reclaim solitude as virtue. But this time I noticed the impulse, and instead of obeying it, I questioned it. Was I protecting myself or avoiding myself? That question changed everything. I started to experiment with presence, staying in conversations past discomfort, admitting uncertainty instead of resolving it, letting silence exist without filling it. These choices felt radical and exhausting. I learned that intimacy without identity is disorienting. You can't say, "This is who I am," and let the label do the work. You have to show up moment by moment. It's inefficient. It's vulnerable. It's real. Not all connections survive this honesty. Some people prefer the old version of me, the predictable one, the useful one, the agreeable one. Letting those relationships fade felt like grief mixed with relief. I began to understand that living without roles doesn't mean living without responsibility. It means choosing responsibility deliberately. Again and again, there were days I wanted structure back, clear expectations, defined success, rules to follow. Freedom, I learned, is heavier than obligation. I made my first conscious commitment, not to a person, not to a project, to a rhythm. I chose a way to move through days that felt sustainable, work that engaged me without consuming me, silence that nourished instead of isolating, connection that didn't require performance. This wasn't ambition. It was alignment. Doubt remained, often, but it no longer paralyzed me. It informed me. Doubt became a signal, not an enemy. I stopped asking, "Is this who I am now?" and started asking, "Does this cost me presence?" If the answer was yes, I reconsidered. If the answer was no, I stayed. One evening, I was asked a familiar question. "So, what do you do?" I paused and answered honestly. "I live more carefully than I used to." They smiled, unsure how to continue. I didn't fill the gap. I realized then that clarity doesn't always communicate. Sometimes it simply exists, and that's enough. I faced my fear of closeness slowly, not by rushing intimacy, by allowing consistency, showing up again and again, without disappearing. That was new. I noticed how often I had left situations emotionally before they ended, how often I'd been present physically but absent internally. Now, when I stayed, I felt exposed, but I also felt real. There were setbacks, moments when I retreated, days when old patterns resurfaced, but I no longer mistook regression for failure. I saw it as information. I learned something essential during this phase. You don't build a life after identity collapse. You inhabit one, piece by piece, choice by choice. Connection became less frequent, but more precise. I stopped trying to be liked, started trying to be aligned. That cost me numbers. It gave me depth. I didn't feel healed. I felt engaged. And engagement, I learned, is quieter than transformation. There was still uncertainty ahead, still fear, still no clear narrative. But I was no longer avoiding the weight of choice. I was carrying it. And for the first time, that weight didn't feel like a burden. It felt like ownership. Stability did not arrive the way I expected. There was no moment of arrival, an internal click, an feeling of being done. What came instead was continuity. Days that followed each other without resistance. Choices that no longer required negotiation with fear. A life that did not ask to be justified. After living without roles for so long, I stopped waiting for identity to return. I understood that nothing was missing. What I had lost was not something to recover. It was something to release. And release creates space. The space was not filled with ambition. It was filled with attention. I noticed how mornings felt different when I wasn't bracing myself for the day. How conversations changed when I wasn't positioning myself within them. How silence stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like presence. I learned to trust small consistencies. Waking at roughly the same time, not out of discipline, but because my body preferred it. Working enough to feel engaged, not enough to disappear. Walking daily, not to improve anything, just to remain connected to my own pace. These were not habits. They were agreements. People sometimes mistook this life for minimalism, or withdrawal, or lack of ambition. I let them. Explaining would have meant translating something that wasn't meant to persuade. I became careful with language, not restrained, intentional. I stopped saying I should, started saying I choose or I won't. The difference was subtle. It changed everything. Fear still appeared, but it no longer dictated structure. It showed up like weather, noticed, not obeyed. I learned that courage is not intensity. It is consistency in the presence of uncertainty. Relationships continued to evolve. Some stabilized. Others faded naturally. A few deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because we promised permanence, because we practiced honesty. And honesty, I learned, has its own gravity. I stopped planning my future as a performance. Stopped imagining how it. Story 109, Part 3. Backhand index pointing down. Look from the outside. I stopped asking whether my life made sense to others. I started asking whether it felt coherent from the inside. That question became my compass. I learned to sit with unfinished things, unanswered emails, unresolved conversations, open possibilities. They no longer felt like failures. They felt like breathing room. There were moments when the old hunger returned. The desire to be recognized, be exceptional, be certain. When that happened, I didn't shame myself. I observed it. Desire, I realized, is not a command. It's information. I began to understand how much of my earlier life had been built around urgency. The need to move forward, to improve, to become. Without that pressure, life slowed, not into stagnation, but into depth. Moments stopped rushing toward conclusions. They simply existed. One evening, while sitting quietly, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't waiting for anything. Not a breakthrough. Not a resolution. Not a future version of myself. I was present, without anticipation. That felt unfamiliar and profoundly grounding. I thought back to who I had been before everything unraveled. So capable, so composed, so absent. I didn't judge that version of myself. I understood them. They were surviving with the tools they had. Now I was living with different tools. Attention, choice, responsibility. None of them were impressive. All of them were necessary. I stopped narrating my life internally. Stopped framing moments as lessons. Stopped asking what everything meant. Meaning, I learned, often appears only after you stop interrogating it. Some days were ordinary, quiet, forgettable, and for the first time that felt like a gift. Not every moment needed to justify itself. Not every day needed a takeaway. I began to feel anchored, not because I had found an identity, but because I had found a way of relating to myself that didn't require distance. I stayed, even when it was uncomfortable. Especially then, there were still choices ahead. Uncertainty hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt honest. I realized something simple and final. A life without roles is not empty. It is exposed. And exposure is not weakness. It is the condition for truth. I didn't rebuild my old life. I didn't replace it with something grand. I learned how to live without hiding. And that was enough. If there is anything this story offers, it's not guidance. It's permission. Permission to live without a label. Permission to choose slowly. Permission to remain unfinished. Because a life that looks complete can still be hollow. And a life that feels uncertain can still be deeply real. I no longer ask who I am. I ask how present I am. And each day, I answer, not with words, but with attention. That is the life I live now. Quiet, unresolved, mine.